And on the panel we have Andrew Mouat, Head of Smart Mobility at ScottishPower. We have Alastair Mumford, who is Energy Manager at Devon County Council, and Dr. Euan McTurk, who is Consultant Battery Electrochemist at Plug Life Consulting. So to start us off, I'd like to hand over to Andrew for some opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Afternoon, everyone. So we're nearing the end of this 2022 EV Summit. I think you'd struggle to find anyone who didn't think it was a really informative and engaging event, full of interesting, knowledgeable people, and I'll try to live up to that standard. One of the many risks of being the last speaker of any event is that much of the material has already been covered, so I've had to change my chat a few times already. However, I think there's still a case for a number of questions to be asked. One of my favorite things about EVs is that it's a truly democratizing technology. So if you want to charge your vehicle at home, fine, you can do that. If you want to provide charging for your staff, go for it. And if you want to decouple your fleet from the oil industry, fine, you can do that too. Never before have we had so much control over our transport energy. But these choices are not available to everyone. We're in a moment of social and economic revolution, an extent of which you probably won't realize for some years to come. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to influence how our society travels and who we rely upon to do so. So that means we have an opportunity and an obligation to change the current model for the better for all of society. And the wholesale shift to EVs may seem like an intimidating task, but I would argue it's the bare minimum we should be doing. Replacing every vehicle, every ICE vehicle, with an EV shouldn't be our objective, and it's a really inefficient way of meeting our climate change targets. We can meet those targets with less vehicles better utilized. It's also a very expensive and resource-intensive way of doing things, and I would argue it's a massive missed opportunity. And given that climate change is a result of our collective activity, and even in a small part, we all have the responsibility to address and redress that. So I sometimes use the analogy of Wi-Fi when I'm trying to explain EV charging to people, about how 20 years ago, very few businesses offered you Wi-Fi, and how they became destination for consumers. And gradually more and more businesses added that. You can now check your social media app of choice wherever you are. In a similar way, drivers are going to shift from this gorging method of consumption of fuel when you go and you fill your vehicle from empty to full with petrol or diesel, but rather they'll seek grazes of charging, opportunistically taking charges as and when they are, when they're going shopping or going to the gym or whatever it may be. And that only works, and consumers will only have confidence in that strategy when we have more chargers than we currently have. So it's good to hear Fiona from Octopus, for example, saying, advocating more slower charging, for example, and we tend to agree. As a slight aside, I think we need to stop talking about charging as a standalone activity, something that we all have to remember to do as part of our busy lives. I think it has to be something that we do as part of other activities, when we're shopping or whatever it might be. Because sometimes when something seems like a big deal, it's just another barrier to changing. Hence, any organization who is encouraging you to travel and park, be it leisure, retail, or your workplace, should be providing a charging amenity, I believe. So the average domestic vehicle is only used for about 9 hours a week. That's 0.5% of its life. And similarly, there'll be vehicles sitting in depots and in commercial properties, not particularly heavily utilized. So there are opportunities for you to share those vehicles, either with friends or neighbors, or perhaps even with your staff or members of the public when not in use for operational needs. Similarly, you'll have chargers that are very infrequently used, be it at home or again in your work premises, that are very infrequently used. And again, you could open them up to neighbors or other local businesses who maybe don't have that facility. Now, the likely initial response to that, I appreciate from many, will be no way, too much liability, too much risk. But I politely remind everyone that we are in a climate emergency and a financial crisis, just to make it interesting. And the existing operating models simply won't work, and they won't work fast enough. Plus, these things are already being done. Your competitors and others in your industry are considering them or doing them. We've already heard from Just Park, for example, or one of many such organizations offering these types of technologies. So if you're not considering them, you're perhaps missing an opportunity again. Sweat those assets, generate a revenue, offset the cost of the transition for you, and provide an amenity for others at the same time. Continuing the theme of responsibility, for CPOs like ourselves, installing chargers is one thing, but installing good quality, well-distributed, reliable chargers in useful locations is another thing altogether, and that's our responsibility, among other things. And then local and national governments have a role to play in this, of course. We've already talked about the 20% VAT application for public charging and the inherent discriminatory nature of that. So, there's a role for them, as always. The Office of National Statistics suggests 41% of people are ready to transition to EVs by 2025. However, the premium nature of EVs means that a significant proportion of the market, arguably the remaining 59%, is being left out and is at risk of being alienated altogether. So I'll simply close by acknowledging that neither I nor ScottishPower have the answers, but it is a challenge that we as an industry need to address. And that's part of the purpose of today's panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'll just start with a reminder about questions for the panel. So if anybody is online and they have questions for the panel, please put the questions into the chat box. We'll take a look at those and they get fed through to me here on stage. And anybody in the room, get your thinking caps on. We'll keep the energy up for this final session. So think about some questions that you might want to be asking as well. So we'll kick off with some sort of deeper intros now with the panellists on stage. If each of you could perhaps give us a little bit of detail about your backgrounds and some of the great work that you're doing in the EV space. And I'll come back to you first on that, Andrew, please.
Sure. So Andy Mouat, Head of Smart Mobility at ScottishPower. We have a variety of propositions across domestic and commercial space, and we bring quite a lot to the table in terms of our ability and capability. Crucially as well, we bring a bit of funding, which is going to be important in this space. In terms of my credentials, I've come from a public sector background, so I've been able to see both sides of the coin, if you like. So I appreciate some of the difficulties some of you have in terms of deploying the charging infrastructure that you perhaps need and want. But crucially, I think we now have the solution to those.
Thanks.
Hi, Alastair, Mumford, Devon County Council. So I've been involved in two projects. So obviously we're a highways authority, but we're also trying to bring together the councils within Devon. There's some that are very well engaged with EVs and less so. So we've had one of our main projects has been a European Regional Development Fund project called Diletti. You have to blame Jacob Roberts from REA for the acronym. I can't even remember now really what it stands for. But I do know it's a small black dress by Hugo Boss, which was completely coincidental. But that's had 2 phases of charge point rollout in car parks. First phase has been delivered by ScottishPower, and the second phase through Gamma Energy through a concessions agreement. And then we've also been involved in a project to test and try and deploy on-street charging in Exeter and hopefully a bit wider. That's the Rapid Charging Devon project with Gamma Energy currently. So hopefully, yes, we're just trying to develop infrastructure within the area. And we've also got our strategy out at the moment for public consultation.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Euan McTurk from Plug Life Consulting. I'm a consultant battery electrochemist who's been working on and driving EVs since 2009. And I actually studied for my PhD in material science right here in Oxford. So good to be back. During the sort of 10 or so years I was in academia, I started my humble little YouTube channel called Plug Life Television that answered many common myths and misconceptions about battery tech and explained, complete with infographics, exactly how they work and how electrochemical phenomena relate to the best practice for electric vehicles and so on. That's apparently been quite well received. So out of that came Plug Life Consulting, where I'm now working on a plethora of technical, strategic and public outreach projects to do with EVs, battery tech, static energy storage and charging infrastructure.
That's great. So to kick off the questions, I'm going to come first to Alastair. So for you, as an officer of a local authority, you have the challenge of trying to make the best decisions for all constituents. How do local authorities use their assets to facilitate the transition to low-emission vehicles?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think collaboration is a key thing that we need to do. So we do try and work together, and that can sometimes be easy and can sometimes be difficult. So generally, most of the councils within Devon have got some kind of strategy, and obviously we've got a Devon County Council strategy, and we're trying to make sure that those align. But that really is helping us to, as part of that work, we've come up with a hierarchy of charging. And so at the top of that, if you've got a driveway, you can charge at home. If you haven't got that, then we would be looking to try and incorporate gullies into the road, into the pavement. If you haven't got that, we might be looking to street lighting. And if you haven't got that, then we'd come down to, is there a car park within a 5 to 10 minute walk of where you are? And if you haven't got that, then we'd be looking at some sort of on-street charging provision, or more like a hub, I suppose. And then if that's not going to be possible, then it's destination charging and maybe something a bit further away. And in that sort of hierarchy, you've got council assets. So obviously we've got the car parks and we've got the pavements. And that's what we're trying to do, is sort of make sure we can put those or leverage those to help with deploying EV infrastructure. So we're looking at our land to try and see where we can make opportunities for people. And of course, car parks is the easiest bit. But, rapid charging hubs, as a highways authority, we'll have bits of land around some important road junctions and things like that. So, how can we get people doing that? But I think also we're trying to push people as well. So as Andrew was sort of referencing, we don't want to convert every car into an EV. So we do need to look at mobility differently. And so we're trying to make sure that car sharing is something we can incorporate wherever it's possible. And obviously mobility hubs, so you can either use bikes or public transport. And then looking at pricing structures as well, which is very, very difficult. But obviously we're trying to work with the private sector to make sure that can be leveraged.
Okay, so Euan, I've got one for you. So EVs are, by their nature, a disruptive technology, but how do we use technology to maximise the utilisation of both the vehicle and charging infrastructure?
I mean, yeah, they're hugely disruptive. They are far more mechanically simple, they're much longer lasting, and you can charge them where they're parked, at depots, for example. So that opens up a lot of interesting opportunities. I'll cover some of the hardware side of it later on, but I want to have a look at the kind of software side of things to begin with, and we'll start with fleets. So there's an interesting take on a car hire club from HireCar, which is a company that provides, as they call it, a car club in a box. So if you have a fleet of, for example, pool cars that are somewhat underutilised, electric pool cars that are used maybe Monday to Friday 9 to 5, but are otherwise sitting not doing much at the weekend, along comes HireCar. They put in this telematics box that allows keyless entry, and they provide a back office booking system that you can confirm or reject depending on your fleet's requirements, and that allows members of the public to come along and utilise that fleet. Insurance is all provided and so on. So yeah, it opens up new opportunities because those vehicles are fully charged, ready to go. And when the customer brings it back, they'll plug it in and it's ready for Monday morning. So that's maximising the utilisation of your fleet. And because it's so mechanically reliable, it's not as if it's going to be massively exacerbating its degradation. It's going to enjoy going for a little weekend run, I suppose. And then in terms of the maximising the utilisation of charging infrastructure, there's two very neat solutions depending on whether you are domestic or whether you're commercial. So co-charge is the one that's quite well known on the domestic side of things. If you have a home charge point with space on your driveway to accommodate someone else, chances are you probably don't plug in your car every night. Most cars on sale these days can do at least 200 miles per charge. The average UK round trip's about 25 miles per charge. So during those 10 to 14 days that you don't need to plug in, you can rent it out to someone else, and that's what co-charge is all about. You list your home charge point on their website, and then local people can find your charge point, book a confirmed charging session, and then you get reimbursed for the energy used. And then there's another step further, which is looking at the commercial side of charging infrastructure too. So there's quite a lot of growing electric fleets these days that don't have enough charging infrastructure or have no charging infrastructure owned by the fleet operator themselves. So there's a company called Voltify that's come up with a solution for this, whereby if you have an underutilized public charging hub, for example, or depot charging hub, where a typical example off the top of my head would be like First Bus in Glasgow, which just has this massive, it's like how many 100 and something high power chargers for buses in use overnight, not in use during the day. But you look at the likes of DPD, they don't have any chargers for their vans, and they'll be out and about and they might need a quick top up. So Voltify can pair fleets that don't have charging infrastructure with off-peak charging infrastructure that's otherwise going to be sitting there doing very little. And there's the opportunity to incentivize that by providing a discounted charging session, because that allows you to sweat that asset as the owner of that charging infrastructure and get more revenue out of it. And it also quickly opens up charging infrastructure to other people. You've just instantly potentially added thousands of chargers to the fleet/residential charging network in seconds just by signing up these companies. And then taking it a final step further, again with Voltify, they've got quite a good user interface whereby it says van 1 is done on charger 3, so move that off and move van 5 onto it for 45 minutes. And you can maximize the utilization of the charging infrastructure that way. It tells you when everything's ready, where everything needs to be. So until we have truly connected autonomous vehicles that can drive themselves as well, we can get human drivers to do the bidding of the software, which is already more than capable of optimizing charging patterns, driving routes, etc. And that would fully maximize the utilization, particularly when you've got shared public transport, for example. All it needs is either integrated into the vehicle's screen on the dashboard, or like an iPhone on a holder saying, you're now going here to pick up this customer that's quite close to this other customer you were picking up, etc. It really does open up this huge ability to maximize the utilization of what is a very robust, long-lived powertrain in a vehicle.
What's important, though, is that when people are looking at the business cases for all these things, they consider these opportunities. I think we're too set in our ways when it comes to establishing business cases, and we look at A versus B without considering all the other things that can go into B. And it's important that these things are considered at that stage, because it does help to make the business case, particularly when we're looking at the high capital costs of the transition, and particularly when we're looking at 3 to 5 year life cycles of budgets. So these technologies are important to be aware of from the outset.
Thank you. So a question for all of you now. How do we maximise access to and suitability of chargers, ultimately making the infrastructure fairer?
There's, again, like some incredible opportunities there. I said I would come back to the hardware side of things. Gully's had quite a few mentions today for people who don't have driveways, and it allows them to charge outside their house. There's another solution, which is the Nodem charge bridge, I should say, which looks like a sort of Victorian-era downpipe on the front of your house, but it actually extends a cable up nice and high across the pavement and drops it at the car. That also, as does Gully to an extent, could provide opportunities for bidirectional charging, in other words, vehicle to house, vehicle to home later on, when that technology catches up and it's not just CHAdeMO that can do it. But if anyone's interested in Nodem, incidentally, I've just spied Ben McDonald, if you raise your hand there, sitting at the front. So if you want to speak to him, if you're a local authority, that's your man. It's quite an innovative solution that he's got there. And then, of course, there's the public charging infrastructure, high power charging infrastructure side of it too. Because one thing that I've seen done fairly commonly up until recently, we should have a row of 50 kilowatt rapid chargers, which is okay, but with cars now typically able to do 100 plus kilowatts, you're only going to get 50 kilowatts out of that. So if you have a site with a comparatively limited grid supply, there's a way that you can charge cars even faster by pooling and sharing the power modules between those chargers. So I think probably the market leader on that is the ChemPower S series. So it's a series of dispensers that all share power modules, which are 25 kilowatt segments. So that same site where it was 6 50 kilowatt rapid chargers, 300 kilowatts maximum, you could have one car charging at 300 kilowatts, 3 charging at 100, 1 at 200, 1 at 75, 1 at 25. You get the idea, and it swaps power modules on the fly. So if you don't have access to fast enough charging at your home or your depot, this will allow you to maximize the charging speed and get back on the road ASAP. And it also means that you're never stuck on the broken charger or the slow charger, because they can all be as fast as the site will allow them to be. And if there's a power module that's failed, it can just be be well, it just doesn't get assigned. It's not like you're stuck on one that's now operating at half power because one of its 2 power modules is broken. And a final point in terms of making charging infrastructure as accessible as possible. It's all well and good having this amazing charging infrastructure until someone comes along with a petrol or diesel car and ices it, internal combustion engine parked in that parking bay. So hot off the press, one of the latest projects I've got is I'm developing an anti-icing solution called Charge Saint. So where you may have a traffic warden who could come along and penalise the offending motorist. They're not going to be there all the time. ANPR cameras are great for charging hubs, but if you've got an individual charge point out in the Highlands, for example, you're never going to have an expensive ANPR camera. This allows anyone with a smartphone to be able to follow the instructions, capture the evidence that's then uploaded to the cloud, verified, sent to the owner of the charging infrastructure, who can then penalise the offending motorist accordingly. So we're trying to make sure that everyone can get an access to a charge when they need it.
Interesting, very interesting. Alastair, anything from you on that?
Yeah, it's mainly asked, I suppose, of the sector. So one of the things we are able to do with Rapid Charging Devon, the on-street, is to, well, we've asked the charge point operator, the CPO, to make sure there's a discounted rate for local residents, so they can start to see some added value from obviously having infrastructure on their streets and taking up space. But during that project, you know, we did some sessions with people in wheelchairs or with mobility issues, and it quickly became clear that having, you know, a car on a different level to a charge point, or even just the charge point itself, it's just impossible for them to use and to use it safely, really. So it's going to be difficult in that area. So we definitely need more innovation within the charge point manufacturing and design sector, and getting charge points that can be used by all. Maybe that is going to only happen when we get automated charging or even wireless charging. But there's definitely a load more work to do, and obviously councils are keen. They've got to speak up for those people who aren't going to be able to use these charge points. And I suppose one of the other things as well that for me is that the number of old charge points we've now, you know, we've got all these lovely, some of them here obviously today, and we've got a lot of old, very bad charge points out there. And I find them hard to use, and I'm sure a lot of people do. And how are we going to get that churn? How are we going to get them improved? So, yeah, unfortunately, it's more sort of asks than solutions, really. But there's a lot more work to be done.
That's a really interesting one, because the hard work is done in terms of the infrastructure.
Yes.
You're replacing the hardware is actually arguably the easy part.
Yeah.
So you by virtue of doing all that hard work up front, you've made it easier to replace them in the long run. I'm a very simple man, and so I like simple solutions. So there are things you can do that don't rely on technology, don't require the cost and the maintenance of that hardware or software. And one of the key things for me is just about educating people, making sure that people understand the etiquette of using charging infrastructure. You know, sitting on a rapid unit for 7 hours while you go to work isn't going to work in the long term. So there's a real onus on the industry as a whole to continue to try and educate users in this, what is a new technology for a lot of people. It's still a car, yes, but it's a car that's used in a different way from what they're used to. So that education piece for me is a very simple, relatively cheap, not easy, I'm not going to suggest, but it is something we have to do.
I'll just challenge that slightly as well, because, you know, I live down in Devon, in Exeter, so near the M5 services. There's it's grid serve situation, charge points there, which are very good. So we now have a situation where people will be parking, charging, so they're having a coffee, but they're charging. And so we have queuing, and we see this at all sort of those larger hubs. There's no design for that queuing. It's chaotic and it's dangerous, but we're putting in more and more installations like that. So yeah, but definitely, you're right, education, both, it needs to work.
Euan? I've actually seen a solution in the Netherlands where there's a large charging hub.
Is that a person with a stick?
No. So you basically turn up at the entrance to the charging hub, and it's almost like a big post office or a TK Maxx checkout, and it says charger number 4, please, and you go to that one. Yeah, and it's all like, you can't miss it. It's huge. You know exactly which one you're going to, and that avoids the queuing chaos.
Yeah, I think it's just the retrofitting, isn't it, into existing car parks, which maybe haven't even got that functionality, but we can get there. Definitely.
Yeah, and in theory, it's doable with a touchscreen. It could be a completely separate system.
Yeah, a lot of back offices now come with the booking functionality. That there are issues in terms of icing and things, and that's not capable of addressing that. But if you book a unit, you're going to be there from X time to Y time, and you booked it, and that charger therefore is no longer available to anyone else, even if they park there. Stuff like that, I think, will come to the fore and be utilised more and help to address that sort of thing. Yeah, particularly when you're on the journey and it's been planned.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to audience questions now. I'll first come to the room. Does anybody here in the room have a question for the panel?
Good afternoon. It's Neil Riddle from Power EV Charge Cards. Government has been pushing quite hard for more equitable charging networks. Their recent consultation on experience of drivers at charge point networks proposed a number of pieces. The piece I'm really interested in is obviously reliability, which would be interesting to hear from the panel about, but also the requirement for all public charge point operators to provide in real time a no terms and conditions access to availability data. So that means that all of your commercial information on utilization of your network is publicly available. Could I get comments on how you feel that might work and what people might be thinking about that currently?
On you go.
I don't really think anybody knows what that means yet. It's part of the issue. And of course, it's going to be really difficult to do in real time, virtually impossible, I would argue. So I'm going to slightly bow out of that answer in that I think we'll just have to wait and see. But thanks for that, Neil. I appreciate the question.
If we're looking at the availability of like reliability data, there are some chargers that are so advanced that they can actually predict when they're about to fail because they've realised that power modules are getting too hot. And there's others where the operators only find out that they're broken when a customer phones up and says, this charger's not working, by the way. So that's going to cause a major issue. There's legacy hardware and some not even that legacy hardware where that automatic availability data really does need improvement. I think part of that's a legacy hardware thing, part of it's a back office thing. But yeah, there's some people who've definitely got some work to do. But in terms of the government wanting an equitable charging network, you've raised a very good point because people who can charge at home only pay 5% VAT and they can get access to off-peak electricity and they can charge off of their home solar panels. But people who cannot charge at home are often reliant on public charging networks unless they have a gully, unless they have a NODEM charge bridge or something similar that allows them to use their home electricity supply. Trojan Energy does something similar as well. But if you are reliant on the public charging network, the cost of electricity for that is artificially expensive, not just because of the cost of VAT on public charging, but because the wholesale cost of electricity is artificially expensive right now. The way that the wholesale electricity market works is the most expensive generator, when they bid in for every half an hour's worth of supply, sets the price that's paid to everyone else. That worked perfectly until gas prices went doolally. So if you were to separate the price of gas from the price of electricity, pay it whatever it needs to stay alive, and then have the next most expensive generator paying basically setting the price that everyone else is paid, say nuclear, then you'd instantly reduce electricity prices for homes and for businesses and for public charging by probably about a third. And then if you were to do a proper windfall tax on oil and gas profits above, say, mid-2019 levels, because the cost of extracting gas hasn't gone up really, but the profits have, and you were to put all of that 100% windfall tax on the excessive profits back into the wholesale electricity market, you'd be right back down to about 15 pence per kilowatt hour and reasonably priced public charging. And then people who don't have access to home or depot charging can have an equitable transition to a much cleaner, more beneficial form of transport.
The only thing to add briefly is I'm pretty sure in the concessions agreement, well, you've definitely got to give us utilisation data. And as we're a local authority, public sector, anybody could do an FOI. So, but I'd like to think that we could try and make that data public. And we do have a big data initiative, I think all local authorities have. So yeah, I'd hope that in Devon at least we can give you data, but obviously that'd be historic data, not real time. Yeah.
The key is you give your customers access to their own portfolio of information. That's going to be a major thing, and not everyone does that. Not everyone's capable of doing that. So I guess that would arguably give real time, but wouldn't necessarily give it to the end user or the user at the charge point at the time. So it's maybe a distinction about who the user is and also what they actually mean by utilization data. Yeah, we'll see, I guess.
We are sadly at the end of our time. I know I could definitely listen to you three all speaking for much longer. So yeah, thank you very, very much to all of our speakers for that brilliant insight and knowledge in the area. It's going to be really exciting to see the developments over the next few years and how we adopt more sustainable transport methods. Now, as we come to a close, I'd like to thank everyone for their engagement at the summit. It's been great to see so many key players under the same roof collaborating on solutions. I'll now ask our panel speakers to leave the stage, and I will welcome Ian Plummer, who is the Commercial Director at Auto Trader, for our closing keynote.